Out here, the wind wasn't the only thing that had teeth. It was a blade against the high plains, sharp and without mercy, scouring the snow from the peaks of the Redemption Mountains and driving it in blinding sheets across the vast, empty ranch land that belonged to Elias Thorne. His house, built of thick-hewn timber and river stone, stood as a solitary fortress against the assault, its windows like two weary eyes staring into the unforgiving white of a world gone silent. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of pine in the hearth and the restless shifting of Elias's own solitude. It had become a physical presence in the room, a cold weight that the fire could not touch. Today, the last day of the year, it felt heavier than ever. He ran a calloused thumb over the rim of a tin coffee cup, the heat a fleeting comfort against his skin. His hands were a map of his life, scarred from wire, hardened by leather reins, strong enough to break a horse or calm one with a single, steady touch. Yet now they felt useless, empty. He had built this life with them, carving out a piece of this wild country and making it his own, but he had built it alone. The memory, the one he kept locked away in a part of his mind as cold and remote as the winter peaks, threatened to surface. The ghost of a laugh, light as a feather, the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke that wasn't coming from his own fire. With a familiar and practiced motion, he pushed it down, his jaw tightening until it ached. Loneliness wasn't a feeling, it was the weather inside his soul, a permanent winter he had learned to navigate. He was respected in the town of Redemption, a man of his word, his herds healthy, his fences straight. But he was known as a man who kept his own counsel, whose eyes, the color of storm clouds, rarely gave anything away. They saw him as strong, stoic. They did not see the deep, hollow ache that had settled in his bones after Sarah was taken by the fever 5 years ago. He had walled himself in ever since, his grief a silent, loyal companion. On this New Year's Eve, the silence was screaming. He stood, the chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, and pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat. The worn-out garment was another symbol of his existence, patched and weathered but stubbornly functional. He would ride into town. He told himself he needed flour, coffee. It was an excuse, and he knew it. He was running from the quiet, from the ghost in the empty chair across the hearth. He was running toward noise, toward other people, even if he had no intention of speaking to them. He just needed to be reminded that the world was still turning, that other hearts were still beating, even if his own felt like it had been frozen solid long ago. But the cold a man chooses for himself is a different beast entirely from the one forced upon you by others. The cold in my Lynn's small cabin was of this second sort. It was a damp, creeping thing that seeped up through the floorboards and clung to the thin blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders. It was the cold of hunger, a gnawing hollowness in her belly that echoed the emptiness of her life since her husband, Wei, had perished in a mining collapse the year before. Her cabin, little more than a shack, was tucked away at the very edge of Redemption, a place for those the town preferred to forget. From her small, grimy window, she could see the distant lights of the main street, warm yellow squares that promised heat and food and laughter she could not share. Tonight was the Lunar New Year, a time that should have been filled with the scent of dumplings and the warmth of family. Instead, her small wooden table was bare, her rice bin held nothing but a few lonely grains, and the only company she had was the mournful sigh of the wind as it rattled the poorly fitted door. She clutched a small, smooth jade pendant that Wei had given her. It was all she had left of him, of their shared dream of building a life in this harsh, foreign land. They had misjudged the welcome they would receive. After his death, the town's quiet suspicion had curdled into open ostracism. She was the outsider, the Chinese widow, a silent reproach to the families who had lost no one. Her quiet strength, her deep sense of integrity, was mistaken for aloofness. Her grief was seen as an alien thing they did not wish to understand. Just an hour ago, she had watched as Silas Blackwood, the town's most prosperous landowner, had ridden past with his sons. He had not looked at her, but she had seen the deliberate way he angled his horse away from her path, the curl of his lip as if her very existence tainted the air. His disdain was a public performance, a reminder to everyone of her place. Blackwood was a man driven by the preservation of his family name and the accumulation of property. He saw Mai Lin not as a person, but as a blight, an unwelcome variable in the orderly, whitewashed society he envisioned for Redemption. He was the architect of the rumors that painted her as unlucky, as proud, as someone to be avoided. His whispers were the reason the sempstress no longer had mending for her, why the baker suddenly had no day-old bread to spare. She was being slowly, deliberately starved out, not with weapons, but with the cold, hard cruelty of indifference. She closed her eyes, her fingers tracing the cool surface of the jade. She would not cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. She had survived loss. She had survived prejudice. She would survive this. She was a resilient survivor, but even the strongest tree can be broken by a long enough winter. And this winter felt endless, its cold reaching not just for her body, but for the very core of her spirit, threatening to extinguish the last embers of hope that flickered there. The town's mercantile was the one place where warmth was for sale, though not every kind was on offer. The bell above the door of Miller's Mercantile chimed a brittle tune as Elias Thorne stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. The store was an island of warmth and light, smelling of sawdust, cured meats, and dried lavender. Lanterns cast a golden glow over barrels of pickles and sacks of flour, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a heat that felt like a blessing. Martha Miller, the proprietor, an older woman with eyes that had seen more winters than anyone in Redemption, nodded at him from behind the counter. She was the town's quiet anchor, dispensing goods and unspoken understanding in equal measure. She offered no pointless chatter, a quality Elias deeply appreciated. He moved through the store with a deliberate, heavy tread, his purpose clear. He gathered his supplies, flour, coffee, a slab of bacon, and a thick cut of beef he intended to roast for his solitary New Year's meal. As he approached the counter, he saw her. Mylin stood near the stove, not for its warmth, but because it was out of the way. She was holding a small, exquisitely embroidered silk pouch, its colors muted but the stitching impossibly fine. She was speaking to Martha in a low voice, her English careful and precise, offering to trade the pouch for a small bag of rice. Elias saw the quiet dignity in her posture, the way she held her head high despite the threadbare state of her coat. He also saw the flicker of regret in Martha's eyes as she gently shook her head. "It's beautiful, Mylin," Martha said, her voice soft but firm. "Truly. But I've no one to sell it to, and I can't spare the rice on trade." "I'm sorry," the words were kind, but they were still a refusal. "A wall." Mylin simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She tucked the pouch back into her pocket, a small, graceful movement of defeat, and turned to leave. For a moment, her eyes met Elias's. It was not a long glance, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He saw in them a loneliness that mirrored his own, a deep, abiding sorrow that she carried with the same stoic silence he did. But he also saw an unbroken strength, a resilience that shamed his own self-pity. She saw him, too, the big, guarded rancher the town kept at a respectful distance. She saw the hardness in his face, but perhaps she also saw the flicker of something else, a shared understanding of pain that needed no words. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of her head and slipped out the door, swallowed by the swirling snow. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the beef in his hand suddenly feeling obscene. He placed his items on the counter. Martha began to tally them up, her gaze shrewd. She had seen the exchange, seen the look that passed between them. She said nothing, merely pushing a small bag of hard candy toward him. "For the new year, Elias." On the house he just grunted in acknowledgement, paid his coin, and left, the brittle chime of the bell marking his exit into the cold, grey world where a woman with eyes full of sorrow was walking home to an empty table. A man can go 5 years feeling next to nothing, and then a stranger's glance in a warm store can split him right open. The ride back to the ranch was a battle. The wind had a voice now, a high, keening howl that tore at his coat and stung his exposed skin. The snow was thicker, the trail harder to see, but the horse knew the way. Elias let the reins go slack, his mind not on the path but on the woman from the store. Her face was etched into his thoughts, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the brutal indifference of the world. He saw her eyes, dark and deep, holding a history of pain he could only guess at. He had spent 5 years cultivating his isolation, honing it into a shield. He had convinced himself that to feel nothing was to be safe. But the brief, silent encounter in the mercantile had pierced that shield, reminding him that he was not the only one in the world drowning in silence. A memory, sharp as breaking glass, finally broke through his defenses. Sarah, her face pale against the pillows, her hand frail in his. Her last words had not been for him, but for their unborn child, a life that had flickered out with her own. "Don't be alone, Elias," she had whispered, her breath a faint mist in the cold room. "Don't let the silence win." He had failed her. He had not only let the silence win, he had invited it in, made it the master of his house. He had mistaken numbness for strength. He reached his ranch, the familiar sight of his sturdy home offering no comfort. It looked like what it was, a monument to loneliness. He stabled the horse, his movements automatic, and went inside. The warmth of the cabin felt cloying, the silence accusatory. He unwrapped the thick cut of beef and placed it in a heavy iron pan, the sizzle as it hit the hot surface loud and jarring. He moved about the room, preparing the meal he had planned, but the ritual felt hollow. Every action underscored his solitude. He was cooking a feast for one. He set a single plate on the rough-hewn table, a single cup, a single fork. The image of Mai Lin's face returned, her expression as she was turned away, her slender frame disappearing into the storm. She was alone, too. But her loneliness was not a choice. It was a cage built for her by others. He stopped, his hand hovering over the pan. He looked at the roaring fire, at the sturdy walls of his home, at the abundance of food on his table. And he felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. His fortress had become his prison. He was hiding from a ghost, while she was fighting a world of real, flesh and blood monsters. In that moment, a decision was made. It was not a thought, but a deep, primal urge, a rejection of the man he had allowed himself to become. He pulled a second plate from the shelf, its clean ceramic surface a stark white against his weathered hands. He carefully sliced the roasted beef, placing half on his plate and half on the other, adding a generous portion of roasted potatoes and gravy. He wrapped the second plate tightly in a clean linen cloth to keep it warm. He was breaking a 5-year vow of solitude, and it felt like the first honest thing he had done since he'd buried his wife. He pulled his coat back on, the familiar weight a different kind of comfort now, and stepped back out into the storm, this time not running from the silence, but carrying a small offering of warmth against it. It was one thing to decide to break his own solitude, but quite another to trespass on hers. The journey back to redemption was driven by a purpose that defied the storm. The wind still howled, but Elias no longer heard it as a lament. It was just wind. The snow still fell, but it was just snow. He rode with his head down, one hand shielding the precious, warm bundle tucked inside his coat. The faint, savory scent of roasted beef was a fragile defiance of the frozen world around him. He found her cabin easily, a dark shape huddled against the vast, white emptiness at the town's edge. It was smaller and more fragile-looking than he had imagined. A single, flickering light shone from its lone window, a tiny, courageous spark of life in the overwhelming darkness. He dismounted, tying his horse to a flimsy post, and walked to the door. For the first time in years, Elias Thorne felt a tremor of uncertainty. He was a man of action, not words. He could face a blizzard, a wolf, or a stampede without a flicker of fear, but standing on this threshold, he felt utterly exposed. What if she refused? What if she saw his act not as one of connection, but of pity? The thought almost made him turn back. Pity was an insult. But what he felt wasn't pity. It was respect. It was a recognition of a shared human experience, a quiet acknowledgement that on this night, of all nights, no one should have to face the cold and the dark alone. He raised his heavy, gloved hand and knocked. The sound was a thunderclap in the immense silence of the night. He heard a faint stirring inside, then the soft scrape of a chair. The door opened a few inches, and Mai Lin stood there, a silhouette against the meager candlelight. Her eyes widened, first in fear, then in confusion, as she recognized the large, stoic rancher from the general store. She clutched the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body tense and ready for a threat. Elias said nothing at first. He simply unwrapped the plate, letting the steam rise up between them in a fragrant cloud. He held it out to her. His voice, when it finally came, was rough from disuse, the words simple and direct, stripped of all pretense. "I made too much," he said, the lie tasting foreign on his tongue. He met her gaze, his own eyes, usually so guarded, holding a raw and unfamiliar vulnerability. "It's New Year's Eve. No one should be hungry tonight." My Lin stared at the plate, then at his face. She saw no pity there. She saw something else, something she had not seen in a very long time, a straight, unvarnished offer of human decency. Her eyes, which had remained dry in the face of public scorn and private despair, suddenly glistened. She did not speak. She simply opened the door wider, a silent invitation. He stepped inside, out of the storm, bringing the impossible warmth of his offering into the cold, quiet space of her life. The air was thick with unspoken truths, with the shared weight of their separate sorrows, and with the faint, trembling birth of a new and unexpected hope. There is a silence that grows between people who have known profound loss, a quiet language that needs no words. The inside of the cabin was barer than Elias could have imagined, yet it was impeccably clean. A thin mattress was neatly made in one corner, and a small stack of books with worn spines sat on an overturned crate that served as a nightstand. There was a profound and deliberate order to the poverty, a testament to the spirit of the woman who lived within it. He placed the plate on the small, scrubbed table, its presence almost overwhelming the space. My Lin moved with a quiet, fluid grace, retrieving a second, mismatched cup from a shelf and a small tin of tea leaves. The simple act of her preparing tea, of sharing what little she had in return for his offering, was a statement of pride and reciprocity that he understood without words. They sat opposite one another, the flickering candlelight carving deep shadows on their faces, making the small cabin feel like the only room in the world. The silence between them was not awkward, it was a space filled with the gravity of their shared circumstances. It was the silence of two people who knew the language of loneliness so well that they had no need for the clumsy translations of small talk. Elias watched her as she ate. She did so slowly, with a delicacy that seemed at odds with the ravenous hunger he knew she must feel. Every bite was savored, a small, private moment of gratitude. He found himself noticing the details of her face, the elegant arch of her eyebrows, the faint lines of exhaustion at the corners of her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw. He was accustomed to the company of men and horses, to a world of blunt force and practicality. Her quiet, resilient presence was something entirely new, a still point in the storm of his own life. For her part, My Lin observed him just as intently. She saw the scars on his hands and the deep lines etched on his forehead, a map of hardship that she could read as clearly as if it were her own. She saw the way he held himself, a coiled stillness, like a man constantly braced for a blow. But in his eyes, those storm-cloud eyes, she saw not the coldness the townspeople spoke of, but a deep, banked sorrow, the embers of a pain that had never been allowed to cool. This was not a man of casual cruelty like Blackwood, this was a man who had built a wall around a wound. She understood walls. The meal was a communion, a sacrament of survival shared on the edge of the world. With each bite, the gnawing cold inside My Lin's belly receded, replaced by a slow, spreading warmth that had little to do with the food itself. It was the warmth of not being invisible, of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a year. For Elias, sharing his food, his fire, his space, was a crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. The silence in his own home was the silence of emptiness. This silence was different. It was full of her presence, of her quiet strength, and it felt, impossibly, like peace. A gift, if it is true, requires one in return. When they had finished, My Lin gently cleared the plates. She moved to the small hearth, where a few meager embers glowed, and added a piece of wood from a small pile. The fire sputtered to life, casting a warmer, softer light across the room. She returned to the table with 2 steaming cups of tea, its fragrant aroma a small, defiant luxury in the barren cabin. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him since he had arrived. The food was. It was a great gift. Elias simply nodded, unsure of what to say. The usual words felt inadequate, hollow. He was a man who dealt in fences and livestock, in the tangible certainties of the earth. The delicate architecture of this moment felt fragile, and he was afraid his clumsy words might shatter it. "Why are you here?" she asked, her gaze direct, not with suspicion, but with a genuine, searching curiosity. "In redemption." "This is a hard place for people like you." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "My husband, Wei, he believed in the mountain. He said it held gold, a new life for us." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. "He found the gold. But the mountain kept him." The simple, devastating finality of her words hung in the air. This was the backstory the town had twisted with their whispers and rumors, reducing a tragedy of love and loss to a cautionary tale about outsiders. Elias felt a surge of cold anger at their willful cruelty. He saw the silk pouch she had tried to trade earlier sitting on the crate beside her books. He gestured toward it. "That was yours?" She picked it up, her touch reverent. "My mother made it for my wedding. The peonies are for honor and riches. The butterflies." For joy she looked at him, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. "She wished me a life I have not found here." It was an offering of her story, a piece of her soul laid bare on the table between them. Elias knew he had to offer something in return. It was a law as old as the mountains, a gift for a gift. He cleared his throat, the words feeling like stones he had to dredge up from a deep, cold well. "I had a wife. Sarah." He said her name for the first time to another person in 5 years, and the sound of it was both a comfort and a fresh wound. The fever took her. "And our child." He said no more. He did not need to. In the shared language of grief, he had said everything. My Lynn's eye softened with a profound, unspoken empathy. She reached across the table, not to touch him, but as a simple gesture of acknowledgement. The invisible wall between them, the one built of culture, of loss, of fear, crumbled into dust. They were no longer the stoic rancher and the Chinese widow. They were just two people, survivors of different storms, who had found a momentary, sheltered harbor in the dead of winter. But in a town built on suspicion, an act of private decency is often seen as a public crime. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and draped in a blanket of pristine, silent white. The rising sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow, and the air was so cold it felt solid in the lungs. Elias left My Lynn's cabin as quietly as he had arrived, a silent nod passing between them that held more promise than 100 spoken words. He rode back to his ranch not with a hollow ache of solitude, but with a strange, new feeling stirring in his chest, a fragile warmth he didn't dare name. Their shared moment of peace, however, was a secret the town would not allow them to keep. Silas Blackwood was an early riser, a man who believed his wealth entitled him to survey his domain, which in his mind included the town of Redemption itself. He was riding past the edge of town, his face a mask of smug satisfaction after a night of festive indulgence, when he saw the tracks. A single horse, leading from the direction of the Thorn Ranch directly to the widow's cabin, and then back again. He reined in his expensive gelding, a cruel, knowing smile spreading across his lips. It was perfect. The proud, solitary Elias Thorn, a man Blackwood had always envied for his quiet strength and the respect he commanded, had revealed a weakness. A depraved one, at that. By midday, the poison had been administered. It started as a low murmur in the saloon, a sly comment to the blacksmith, a carefully worded concern shared with the ladies outside the mercantile. Blackwood was a master of insinuation. He didn't need to shout, his whispers were far more effective. He painted a sordid picture, the lonely rancher, his mind perhaps affected by years of isolation, seeking comfort in the arms of the foreign woman. He implied sickness, impropriety, a betrayal of everything the good, decent folk of Redemption stood for. Elias rode into town later that day for supplies and felt the change immediately. It was in the way men averted their gazes, the sudden silence that fell when he entered the blacksmith's shop. It was in the tight, disapproving frown on the baker's wife's face. The community he had never truly been a part of was now actively turning against him, their quiet respect replaced by suspicion. The confrontation came, as Elias knew it would, in front of the mercantile. Blackwood was waiting for him, flanked by his two brutish sons. "Thorn, Blackwood said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. I'd have thought a man like you would have better taste. Or at least more discretion. Elias stopped, his body going still. He didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at Blackwood, his storm cloud eyes flat and cold. You have something to say to me, Blackwood, say it plain. The Blackwood chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. Just a word of advice. Some things, some people, are best left alone. They can bring a sickness to a town. A blight. We wouldn't want your fine ranch to become contaminated. The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of prejudice. It wasn't just about my Lynn anymore. It was about his land, his livelihood, his place in the world. Elias felt the old, familiar anger rise, the instinct to answer the threat with violence. But then he thought of my Lynn's quiet dignity, her resilient strength. Fighting Blackwood with his fists would only prove the man's point, dragging them both down into the mud. He had to be better. He simply held Blackwood's gaze, his silence a more powerful rebuke than any curse. You stay away from her, he said, his voice a low growl. He turned and walked away, leaving Blackwood standing in the street, the victor of the public exchange but unsettled by the cold, unyielding promise in Elias Thorne's eyes. A man can build a fortress to keep the world out, but the day always comes when he has to decide whether to use it as a prison or a shield. The ride home was a torment of a different kind. The whispers of the town followed him, colder and sharper than any winter wind. He had lived his life by a simple code, mind his own business, expect the same from others. But Blackwood and the town had violated that code. They had trespassed not on his land, but on something far more sacred, a fragile connection he was just beginning to understand. He reached his ranch and for a long time, just sat on his horse, looking at the house he had built. It had been his fortress against grief. Now, it felt like a coward's retreat. Sarah's last words echoed in his mind, don't let the silence win. By hiding himself away, he had allowed men like Blackwood to fill that silence with their own ugliness. He had a choice. He could retreat now, sever the tentative bond with my Lynn, and the town would eventually forget. His solitary existence would be restored, his reputation salvaged. The thought was a sour taste in his mouth. It was the choice of a man he no longer wanted to be. Or he could stand. He could turn his fortress into a shield, not just for himself, but for her. He could face the town's judgment and Blackwood's threats, and in doing so, honor the memory of the wife who had begged him not to live alone and the quiet courage of the woman who had reminded him how. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. The next morning, he rode not to his own pastures, but directly back to my Lynn's cabin. He found her outside, gathering fallen twigs for her fire, her movement slow in the biting cold. She saw him coming and straightened, her expression wary, as if she could already feel the town's animosity radiating from him. He dismounted and walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. The town is talking, he said, his voice direct. There was no point in hiding it. Blackwood. His spreading lies, my Lynn's shoulders slumped slightly, the familiar weight of ostracism settling on her once more. I am used to it, you shouldn't have to be, he stated, the words a declaration. I have a large house. Work that needs doing. Mending clothes, tending a garden when the spring comes. I'll pay you a fair wage. You'd have a safe place to stay. It was more than an offer of a job, it was an offer of sanctuary. An alliance. He was publicly tying his fate to hers. My Lynn looked at him, searching his face, and saw the unshakable resolve there. She saw that he was offering her not charity, but partnership. A chance to rebuild, to belong. She gave a single, firm nod. I will get my things. As they rode out of town together, my Lynn seated on his steady horse behind him, her meager belongings tied in a bundle, the curtains of Redemption's houses twitched. Martha Miller, standing on the porch of her mercantile, watched them go. She did not frown or whisper. Instead, a slow, appreciative smile touched her lips. She went back inside, and when Silas Blackwood entered a few minutes later, she looked at him over the top of her spectacles. "I'm afraid I'm all out of the tobacco you like, Silas," she said, her voice cool as ice. "And I'm not sure when I'll be getting more of it." Was the first shot fired in a quiet rebellion, a small act of decency that signaled the turning of a tide. Rebellion doesn't always come with a roar, sometimes it's as quiet as two people choosing to build a life in defiance of the world. The winter slowly loosened its grip on the high plains. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping brown earth beneath, and the Chinook winds brought the first, faint scent of spring. On the Thorn Ranch, another kind of thaw was taking place. My Lin brought a life to the silent house that Elias hadn't realized it was missing. It wasn't in loud noises or constant chatter, but in small, quiet changes. The scent of herbs drying in the kitchen, the sight of a mended curtain hanging straight, the presence of her books by the hearth. She worked with a tireless, graceful efficiency, her quiet competence a balm to the rough edges of his world. She gave the stoic ranch a heart. Elias, in turn, gave her a space to heal. He treated her with a deep, unwavering respect that was a silent rebuke to the town's prejudice. He learned the rhythm of her days, her love for the morning light, her moments of quiet reflection. They fell into a comfortable routine, their lives braiding together as naturally as the currents of a river. Their connection was not a sudden fire, but the slow, steady growth of a deep-rooted tree. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water by the door for her so she wouldn't have to use the pump. It was in the way she began leaving a hot cup of coffee on the mantel for him when he came in from the cold. It was in their shared evenings by the fire, where silence was no longer a sign of sorrow but of deep, abiding comfort. One evening, she showed him the characters of her language, painting them on a piece of scrap paper with a makeshift brush and ink. She told him their meanings: strength, hope, family. He watched her hands, so delicate yet so strong, and felt a profound sense of wonder. He, in turn, took her out to the corral and showed her how to gentle a frightened foal, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender as he calmed the animal. She saw in that act the true nature of his strength, a power used not for breaking, but for protecting and healing. The town of Redemption, led by the quiet defiance of Martha Miller and a few other good souls, had turned on Blackwood. His whispers had lost their power, his influence shriveling under the steady light of Elias and My Lin's shared integrity. The supportive community they had never sought began to form around them, a chosen family built on respect rather than prejudice. One warm spring afternoon, Elias found My Lin in the small plot of land beside the house, where she had started a garden. Her hands were covered in rich, dark earth as she carefully planted seeds. He came and stood beside her, holding out a small, crudely fashioned but sturdy wooden trowel he had made for her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and the touch was electric, a promise of everything they had built and everything that was yet to come. "This is a good place," she said softly, looking not at the garden, but at the house, at him. Elias looked at her, at the resilient survivor whose quiet strength had breached his walls and brought life back to his frozen world. He saw his future in her eyes. "It's a home," he said, the word finally feeling true. The sun warmed their faces, the vast, open sky stretching above them, no longer a symbol of their isolation, but a canopy for their new beginning.